People will also worry about a trigger getting accidentally pulled on the holster as they reholster their cocked revolver. This sort of thing undoubtedly did happen. For example, a highway patrolman cocked his revolver to cover two felons while his partner handcuffed them before reholstering his weapon. The revolver had its trigger snagged because of this and sent a round into the ground next to his ankle. However, this patrolman would have done the same thing with a double-action single-action pistol that was cocked before he reholstered it. So you could blame the mechanics of the gun and issue all of your patrolmen double-action only guns because of one incident of poor judgment. Or you could say that any holster that pulls the trigger is not a good holster. Yet another option would be to say that you should always decock your revolver or pistol before reholstering. The last option is a good rule regardless of this incident, and it is not overly hard to accomplish either. Some have also essentially said that people are losing sight of the safety advantage of double-action triggers, as the triggers on striker-fired guns keep getting lighter and shorter. There is a problem with this logic though, because striker-fired triggers are not getting lighter and lighter as time progresses. Arguably, there has always been demand for good, reasonably light triggers, and there always will be demand for this. Likewise, it's pretty clear that the reason why people moved away from double-action pistols is because they were harder to shoot than today's striker guns, and because the double-action trigger is not a significant advantage as far as safety goes. So it's not that people are ignoring the safety advantages of a heavy trigger, it's more like that the advantages were probably not that relevant to begin with. Which brings me to my next point. Double-action triggers were portrayed as an advantage for a novice shooter because they could be kept with a round in the chamber and without needing a manual safety. Glocks and M&Ps have trigger safeties that require a section of the trigger to be pulled before the gun can fire. This means that without a manual safety, all it takes to inadvertently fire the gun is 5.5 or 6.3 pounds of force on that section of the trigger. This is not a very large safety problem for obvious reasons, one of which being is that they come with trigger guards, which prevent the trigger from being pulled inadvertently. Another reason being that with a trigger that is significantly heavier than the gun's overall weight, even if a random object was holding the entire gun's weight on the trigger would still not be pulled enough to actually fire the gun. So let's say I get one of those polymer frame 1911s, and it just so happens to weigh as much as a polymer striker gun, and for some reason it doesn't come with a manual safety or grip safety. And it also has a custom trigger made that is the same size as the trigger safety on an M&P, and the trigger weights happen to be identical. In this thought experiment, it wouldn't make much sense to worry about the 1911 being inherently unsafe because it's single action compared to a standard M&P. Yes, the 1911 will have a shorter trigger pull, but that doesn't actually mean that much because it takes the same amount of force to fire. People also like to make the argument that John Browning intended you to carry the 1911 cocked and locked, so let's dive into that. The first auto-loading, non-prototype pistol that John Browning made was the Model 1900, and it had a manual safety that doubled as a rear sight. When the safety was turned off, you had a sight picture. Because the safety configuration was a bad idea from both a practical and mechanical perspective, it was removed on the evolution of the pistol, the 1902 Sporting model, and there was no safety feature that replaced it. The Colt Pocket Hammerless, which was produced starting in 1903, had a manual thumb safety and a grip safety. To include a manual safety to begin with on the 1900 implies that you would be carrying it around in the chamber and the hammer cocked because the safety would be a useless feature if you were not doing those things. To have the next evolution of the gun, the 1902 version that does not have any safety features, would imply that it is better to have no safety and a round in the chamber than an impractical safety. Likewise, to reintroduce safety features on the Colt Hammerless starting in 1903 implies that to Browning it is advantageous to have safety features provided that they are not impractical. Likewise, the Colt Model 1910 was intended to be used for military service, and it did not have a manual safety. Only when the military asked for a manual safety and grip safety feature were they added to the next evolution of the gun, the 1911, which was then adopted. According to a book written by the U.S. Ordnance Department, they say that the M1911 should not be carried with the hammer cocked and the safety on, unless it is an emergency. Given the fact that they say only a full blow from the hammer can fire a round, this does not come from a concern of the weapon's mechanical safety. Rather, this can only be a distrust in the individual soldier's ability to carry the gun without posing a danger to himself or others. The part about the gun only firing when receiving a full blow from the hammer is in fact wrong. If you pull the hammer partially back and drop it, this may be enough force to set off the cartridge. Likewise, if you accidentally drop a 1911 on the muzzle and on a hard object, it is possible for the firing pin to have enough momentum to discharge the weapon. However, a testing report in 1907 specified that the government wanted a handgun that had an automatic safety so that a round could be carried in the chamber so that the gun could immediately be fired without needing to perform any other action than pulling the trigger. This can only mean that if the user of the weapon was actually competent, he would be perfectly fine carrying the weapon with a round in the chamber, a cocked hammer, and the manual safety off. The idea being that an automatic safety, like a grip safety, would be enough protection by itself. This logic still holds true today, except we generally have guns with trigger safeties rather than grip safeties. So given that the 1910 had no manual safety, it seems that John Browning actually did not see it as a key feature for a military weapon. The evidence seems to point to the conclusion that Browning's intent was for you to carry your gun cocked, with a round in the chamber, and the existence of a safety to him would be more useful to a citizen, not particularly useful to a soldier, and overall not a crucial feature to have on a handgun. So when people say that Browning wanted you to carry your 1911 cocked and locked, that claim is not technically true from what we can see, and it is based on the belief that Browning put the manual safety on the 1911 because he wanted you to use it. In reality, the manual safety was from government requirements. Likewise, Browning wanted to make a pistol in .41 caliber, but that got sidetracked by the government's arbitrary requirement for a .45 caliber handgun. While this history lesson may be interesting, a rigid dogmatic adherence to beliefs that were held over 100 years ago would not help anyone today. So from a modern self-defense standpoint, it does make sense to carry your 1911 with the hammer cocked and the safety on, and it's not such a big deal either that we have .45s instead of .41s. Going back to double action, Chuck Taylor says the following: is the DA self-loader safer? No, it is not. In fact, in my 20-plus year career as a firearms trainer and consultant, I have seen more accidental discharges with DA autos than with SA self-loading designs, because it forces its operator to perform more physical procedure on it. Not surprisingly, the novice often becomes confused to the point where safety is negatively affected. So it should be clear to everyone now that a double action / single action pistol is not inherently better for a novice shooter. If someone makes the argument that something will get in the trigger guard and inadvertently pull the trigger somehow while holstering or unholstering the gun, you have to ask what object would likely do this and why. There is one example of an officer accidentally getting a drawstring from his windbreaker inside the trigger guard of his Glock as he holstered it, so when he took the windbreaker off, the weapon discharged. Unless the amount of decorative pins on your clothing rivals that of a North Korean general, the most likely object that would get inside the trigger guard of a weapon and accidentally discharge it is a button on your shirt. The why part of that equation would likely be that you use appendix carry and that you are wearing a shirt with buttons on it. The combination of these things would put the gun next to the buttons. If you holster and unholster enough times, aggressively and carelessly, this could potentially be a problem. However, as a regular citizen, you do happen to be in charge of what you wear and how you carry your gun, so you can avoid poor choices in either of these things. I also have to make the point that if safety was proportionally and directly increased with trigger weight, and this feature did actually make the gun significantly better for self-defense use, then logically almost all self-defense guns would have very heavy triggers because it's such a good feature. The reason why this is not the case, I believe, is obvious. It is far more important to both novices and highly skilled shooters to have a gun that has a lighter trigger and that is easier to shoot well. A double-action pistol, or a revolver for that matter, is not the best weapon for a novice. With that in mind, there are some types of guns that have double-action triggers that is noticeably better than others in both weight and in quality. To understand the rise of double-action triggers in pistols specifically, we need Massad Ayub's perspective. He points out that it all started out with lawyers. Specifically, lawyers found it easier to argue that a defensive shooting was in fact manslaughter due to a negligent discharge. To argue that the defensive shooting was in fact outright murder is far harder. With a double-action trigger that is very heavy, really no one can argue that it has a hair trigger and that you accidentally shot someone. Similarly, the Miami police officers wanted to switch from revolvers to pistols. The only problem was that their chief did not want to do this, so he made the unreasonable and spiteful requirement that the new pistol had to be double-action only and in 9mm. The reason he made that specific requirement was probably twofold. There were no pistols that were made like this at the time. Secondly, there was a justified shooting that happened recently. A police officer by the name of Alvarez shot a criminal who was pulling a gun. The state attorney manufactured a bogus argument that Alvarez cocked the revolver and accidentally shot the criminal because of this. Between the shooting and the trial, Miami had all of their police revolvers changed to double-action only because of this. These guns were referred to as Alvarized in the same way someone may refer to a censored book as Baudelarized. So because of a bogus legal argument against an officer who was doing his job, we have the requirement for double-action only guns in the supposed name of safety. So the Miami Police Union and the firearms instructors went to major gun manufacturers like Beretta, SIG, and Smith & Wesson to ask for a double-action only 9mm. The gun manufacturers rightfully said no, and that it was a stupid idea. Poetic justice was achieved when the ATF ruled Glocks as having a double-action trigger. Thus, the Miami police got Glocks, and Beretta, SIG, and Smith & Wesson now felt the need to make double-action only guns to appeal to the police market. So now we have double-action only guns being made to fit a spiteful requirement that should have never been made in the first place. One might say that if Miami had a better police chief, and if Florida had a better state attorney, all of this foolishness could have been easily avoided. Then we would not be making mechanical solutions for a manufactured political problem. This is why Jeff Cooper was unquestionably right when he said that double-action only pistols were an ingenious solution to a non-existent problem. Yes, I am very critical of Jeff Cooper sometimes, and that shows that I have a nuanced view, which is why we can independently come to the same conclusion about some things. Also, the FBI decided that only the elite hostage rescue unit was competent enough to be trusted with single-action guns. These were customized Browning high powers, in case you were wondering. Also, the FBI decided that only the elite hostage rescue unit was competent enough to be trusted with single-action guns. These were customized Browning high powers, in case you were wondering. In comparison, all other agents were deemed to be not trusted with single-action and were given double-action/single-action pistols instead. The rationale being that in almost all accidental discharges are one-shot events, and if more shots are fired, that is because the agent is in a gunfight and should not be needlessly hindered by a double-action only pistol. This two-tiered system inherently accepts the fact that single-action design is superior, and that the real problem is the user and not the weapon. As the years went by, it also became clear to the FBI leadership that the decision to use double-action/single-action pistols was not a good one, which is why the FBI now uses striker-fired guns, Glocks specifically. Likewise, many other law enforcement departments saw the error in their ways and switched to striker-fired guns. On an interesting side note, there was an insightful comment here about how if you were wearing thick gloves and shooting a revolver, the glove material would block the trigger return and jam the revolver. This was not a problem with pistols in comparison. This is probably what happened in this video of a bear charge. Fred Eichler had a revolver and gloves on when his gun jammed after he shot a warning shot into the water. Warning shots are generally of questionable effectiveness against bears, in my opinion.